Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and we are going to continue on with the bell curve today. Chapter 7, all about unemployment, idleness, and injury. So more to do about careers, jobs, IQ as it is tied to performance in the jobs, although we're going to be looking at it from a different aspect, keeping your job, unemployment, so being out of work, your chances of not being in the labor force, and how that is tied to IQ, if it is even tied to IQ. I think based on the previous chapters, guys, from this part 2 that we're on, all about like the social aspects of society and IQ, you might kind of guess how IQ is related to these things: employment, your chances of being injured on the job, or your chances of being out of the labor force. But let's find out for real. Let's just dive right into it. Having a high IQ makes it easier to do well in the job. Remember, we saw this from, I believe it was chapter 3, when we were looking at the armed forces and looking at the IQ, basically like the IQ test, the AFQT that recruits take when they get into the military, before they get into the military, and then how well they do in their specific position in the military. And we saw that the validity was pretty high for this test, the AFQT. And I believe they did it based on supervisor ratings, as well as, I believe, a written evaluation as well was incorporated. There was 3 things, if you guys remember, how they used to measure your performance on the job. The military, if you guys remember from that chapter, a very good source because everything is documented, and they basically kind of take an IQ test for these cadets. At least they did at the time of this book release. I gotta imagine it's kind of the same now. But okay, so that's for, hey, how well do you do in your job? What about that? Let's go to our first graph. They're going to kind of here talk about a little bit of the history and the trend line that's been set since the mid 1950s, going all the way to the time of the release of the book, to the early 90s. And we have this graph that says, since mid-century, teenage boys not in school are increasingly not employed either. So if you guys remember the previous chapter on high school dropouts, who was dropping out of high school, who was getting the GEDs, who was staying in school, well, we saw from data it had more to do with IQ than it did parental socioeconomic status. IQ was a definite, well, according to the graphs, a definite protective factor in staying in school and not dropping out. So now, among the men who are not in school between these ages, 16 and 19, there's an ever-increasing downward trend in the percentage of those men who are employed. So more and more, we have more, I guess you could say, maybe a dropout of the labor force. So it says here in 1953, the first year for which the data are available, more than 86% of these young men had jobs. And then in 1992, it was just 66%. And you can see that from this graph, that trend line decreasing over the last about 40 years. Let's continue on to the next slide. Labor force dropout. This is going to be the first thing they look at. So what is labor force dropout? What is labor force participation? So participating in the labor force is all about you are either looking for work or you are employed. All right, it's one of those 2 things. You're either already working or you're looking for work. And you can see in the top right corner, I took this from Investopedia, their definition here. Labor force participation rate is a measure of an economy's active workforce. The formula for the number is the sum of all workers who are employed or actively seeking employment. So there you have it there from Investopedia. So there are legitimate reasons for not being in the labor force. You could be a full-time student. I have a list right here if you guys see that. You could be disabled. You could be in the armed forces. You could be retired, a stay-at-home and dad. All these very legitimate reasons for not being in the labor force. So the data, part of the data that they used for this book, I mean, we already know that a good chunk of their statistics, graphs, etc., come from the NLSY. Specific to the 1990 interview wave, 93% of the males, specifically white, in that wave had jobs, and then 5% were out of the labor force. So already that's not really that much of the labor force, or that much of a percentage of that interview wave. We're talking about 5%. So when we go to the next slide here, think about that this table is looking at that 5%, right? Does IQ have anything to do with not being in the labor force? So we have a chart here again comparing the percentage of young white men who spent a month or more out of the labor force in very dull. And we do see a trend here going from very high to very dull in cognitive class. An increasing percentage of those who are out of the labor force for a month or more. Okay. One thing I guess you could say is, again, this is just looking at that 5% of the 1990 interview wave. I know it says they're 1989. Maybe this was looking at 1989 was like the stats that they have from, and then they interviewed them in 1990. We'd have to get clarification on that. But again, maybe these guys ended up getting jobs after like a month or 2 months. You know, maybe they weren't out of the labor force for that long, at least a month, but maybe they eventually got jobs. So that we don't know. Let's continue on. We're going to look at now comparing, as we have done in the previous chapter, socioeconomic background versus cognitive ability, and look at this graph here. IQ and socioeconomic background have opposite effects on leaving the labor force among white men. So we have the dependent variable here, as we've seen from the previous chapters, is going to be the probability of spending at least a month out of the labor force, right? So the independent variables are going to be IQ, socioeconomic status here. And when they take a look at one independent variable, we're holding the other one at the mean. So when we look at IQ, as IQ goes from low to high, we're holding the parental SES at their mean values. So a man from a high socioeconomic status was more likely to be out of the labor force than somebody who was of low that's a tongue twister, socioeconomic status. Wow. And then it's kind of the opposite for IQ. IQ had a large positive impact on staying at work as you go from very low to very high, right? Almost a 14% decrease in your chances of being out of the labor force, going from 2 standard deviations below the mean to 2 standard deviations above the mean for IQ. Keep in mind again, of that 22%, that's 22% of the 5% that did not have jobs, right, in the 1990 interview wave. And then even class 5, you're talking about the dull class. This is the not so smart group of these white males. Still 78% of them did have jobs. So think about that. Still most of them have jobs, but just comparatively to the upper echelons of the cognitive classes, there is a marked difference there. But I'll tell you what is going on with the socioeconomic status? Why does a higher socioeconomic status increase your chances of being out of the labor force? And one of the reasons the authors kind of talk about here is that a higher socioeconomic status maybe could potentially give you more comfort, right? There's not as much pressure to go out and find a job because you are perhaps maybe living with your parents, living off your parents, and maybe they're not pushing you as hard to go out there and find a job. So that could be a potential reason. What about education here? So they're going to take a look at now if they split this interview wave into those that have high school diplomas and have bachelor's degrees. All right, so they're essentially going to have two graphs like the one we just had. And they found that there was really no difference between having a bachelor's degree and those having a diploma, although high intelligence played a larger independent role in reducing labor force dropout among the college sample than the high school sample. But again, the probability of dropping out rose with increasing socioeconomic status, so just like we saw with the previous graph. Now, what we are talking about here in the second bullet point, why maybe high intelligence played a larger independent role in reducing labor force dropout among the college sample, is maybe because, well, now these people that are of high IQ that now get a bachelor's degree, their job prospects go up, right? You got a bachelor's plus you are very, very smart. You're going to interview well. You're going to test well. Well, you can't administer an IQ test for a job unless it's testing like specific requirements of that job. We know that from the Supreme Court case. We talked about this earlier. But still, your job prospects are probably that much higher. Now you're probably going to get picked up by a job fairly quickly. So I think that it is what that second bullet point is talking about there. So that's unemployment. What about job disabilities now? We move on to this chart, again, comparing the cognitive classes, and look at this. The number who report being prevented from work by health problems, and then look as it increases as you go down the cognitive classes, and then the same with those who are reported limits in amount or kind of work by health problems. So on the one hand, you're prevented from working. On the other hand, you're prevented from doing certain things at work. And look at the increase as you go down the cognitive classes. Job disabilities increasing as you go from very bright to very dull. And it's a fairly staggering increase. And on a blue-collar job, you're more likely to get hurt, which then would prevent you from working further, and then perhaps you drop out of the labor force like that. Although, look at these statistics here. Blue-collar versus white-collar jobs, 38 out of 1,000 for the blue-collar, and then 28 out of 1,000 of the white-collar are reporting health limitations. So obviously more for the blue collar, but that doesn't seem like that much more, 38 to 28. And then also 5 out of 1,000 versus 2 out of 1,000 reporting being prevented from working altogether. All right, again, that's not like staggeringly that much as I would have thought. Now, what about comparing apples to apples here? If you're comparing two men, both who are in blue-collar jobs, the authors stated here from their research, a man with an IQ of 85 had double the probability of work disability of a man with an IQ of 115. And we kind of do see that from the table. So 85, I mean, you're probably talking about the very dull class versus 115. You're talking about the bright class, class 2. So, yeah, we kind of do see that from the chart there. You see double, triple, I mean even more for the being prevented from working altogether. So it kind of backs up that data. And then the authors talk about here studies from Lewis Terman, who, this is on page 162. Lewis Terman sample of people with IQs above 140. Accidents were well below the level observed in the general population. And then there's other studies that have talked about how motor vehicle accidents rise as the driver's IQ falls. So there's other studies that kind of show here your chances of getting hurt at work, on the job, potentially increase as your IQ lowers. Let's continue on. Now let's talk about unemployment. Different than the labor force participation rate, because this looks at those in the labor force, those in the labor force participation rate who are not at work, right? So it's essentially not even looking at those. It's axing out the people from that equation who are looking for work because they're not currently working. So that's the unemployment rate. That's what the unemployment rate would be. So look at the chart on the right. Which white young men spent a month or more unemployed in 1989? And as we can see, there was an increase going down the cognitive classes, right? You go from, pretty good increase. You're talking about a 6-time increase. That is true. It's still 12%, though. That's it's higher compared to the other ones, but still, you're talking about 78% of that cognitive class is still at work, not unemployed. So they're going to compare this now, socioeconomic background versus cognitive ability, just like we did for the other ones, or at least for labor force participation rate. And check this graph out, again, comparing IQ to SES. High IQ lowers the probability of a month-long spell of unemployment among white men, while the socioeconomic background didn't really have an effect at all. Look at that line. It's almost like a horizontal line. Maybe it's a slight upward trend, maybe, but for the most part, SES didn't really seem like a factor. IQ, though, staggering factor here. As you go from low IQ to high IQ, your chances of being unemployed for a month or more than 10%. But again, you're going from 14% to like 4% here. As we've seen before for like poverty, remember the y-axis in the graphs that we saw for poverty? Huge staggering difference. Like we were talking like 20 plus percentage points, and here, not as high. So maybe you could say is the data does show there could be a correlation here, but is there something else that kind of explains this drop out of the labor force, or this unemployment, your chances of being unemployed? I'm not sure. So to conclude, most white males at every cognitive level were in the labor force. That's something to remember here. Even class 5, the very dull, and the authors mention this, most of them are still at work. 78% of them. Even class 5, 7 out of 10 were in the labor force for all 52 weeks of 1989. So keep that in mind here. Intelligence has its various forms like maturity, farsightedness, competence, and the authors talk about how all of these are important in keeping somebody employed. Oops, and that actually was the last point. But the data, like I said, it shows that there is a difference, but it's not as staggering as we've seen in the previous chapters, like with poverty, with maybe even the dropout rate. It does have an effect on this, but I would be interested to see if it has more, if other things have more of an effect on if you stay employed or not. Something to consider further. And again, the book was written in the early 90s. What would that trend be today? Do you think this data holds up today? Guys, thank you very much for listening. I got a little carried away. I know you're staring at a blank screen right here, but if you listen this far, thank you very much. I really, really appreciate it. Let me know if you have any questions, you want to start a discussion, please comment below. Please like the video, subscribe. We've got another bell curve coming next week on Chapter 8. Can I tell you guys what Chapter 8 is? What was Chapter 8? I can tell you maybe really quick if I can flip there fast enough. Family Matters. Oh, okay, I remember this one. Family Matters. Yeah, that should be a good one. We got that coming next week. And again, guys, thank you very much. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care, everybody.